Good morning from Minneapolis. The president has expressed his relief and hopes that it will represent a moment of significant change for America. The jury took just over 10 hours to deliver what had been anxiously waited for weeks. Late last night, the former police officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for more than 9 minutes. His reaction in court, unflinching. George Floyd's family have said, finally, it's a good day to be a Floyd. The whole world witnessed what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd.
All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict.
But it was a jury that rendered the ultimate judgment.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20...
There was almost no reaction from the former police officer, guilty on 3 counts of murder and manslaughter. Then, like Mr. Floyd, handcuffed behind his back. Unlike Mr. Floyd, given the dignity of being treated with respect. The trial examined in harrowing detail the last moments of Mr. Floyd's life in May last year. The justice that so many had demanded.
Guilty!
Welcomed outside court. The jubilation mixed with relief in a city and a country that have been on edge.
Feeling better now. Nothing is going to make it all better, but at least, God, now there's some justice. Right.
Within minutes, the Floyd family received a phone call from the president and vice president, who then addressed the nation to call for this to be a moment America embraces change.
We are all a part of George Floyd's legacy, and our job now is to honor it and to honor him.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Those are George Floyd's last words. We can't let those words die with him. We have a chance to begin to change the trajectory in this country. It's my hope and prayer that we live up to the legacy.
The images of Mr. Floyd's death are seared into the consciousness of so many.
Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name! George Floyd!
Perhaps most of all, those of his family.
I will salute him at every day of my life. I will salute him because he showed me how to be strong. He showed me how to be respectful. He showed me how to speak my mind. I'm gonna miss him, but now I know he's in history.
Yay.
What a day to be a Floyd, man.
So today is a pivotal moment for America. It's something this country has needed for a long time now.
Yes.
And hopefully today is the start of that. When I say a pivotal moment, we need change in this broken system. It was built to oppress us. It was built against us.
It isn't over yet. Chauvin's sentencing and the trial of the other officers there that day lie ahead. Minneapolis and America were waiting for this moment. But as the prosecutor said, this was accountability for one police officer. Justice will take the work of a whole nation. Well, outside the court, thousands cheered when the verdicts were announced, among them George Floyd's brother and his girlfriend, who expressed their relief at the conviction, but also their grief. Sky's Sally Lockwood is in Minneapolis and has this report.
As they waited for the verdict, Minneapolis braced. The tents there exploding with emotion. People breaking down. They did it. Justice for George Floyd. And a ruling that told black citizens they matter. But no one was more anxious than George Floyd's brother, representing the family in court.
I can get sleep now. I paced back and forth before I even went into the courtroom. And I sat in one spot in the corner, the same spot by the trash can I always sat at, and I prayed. and I prayed for like 30 minutes. And the verdict came back when the jurors came out, guilty, guilty, and guilty. And I just couldn't believe it, because African-American people, we never get justice. We feel like it's just us.
People spilled into the streets, drivers stopping their cars to join the celebrations. George Floyd's girlfriend came to see the history made from her immense loss.
I miss Floyd so much, you know, it's hard to think about how I feel, but I do know that I'm really hopeful for change right now. I feel like this has just opened up a door for so many people to have their cases reopened, to have people get justice for their lost loved ones.
This ruling has given a community still hurting some much-needed hope.
Today is another step to justice for all black people and colored people around the world.
Going forward, we will hope to see a change. We'll hope to see people like us policing the police.
George Floyd!
And people marched, perhaps feeling that little bit more protected.
This guilty verdict is an important step towards healing for this community, but it's also a verdict of what society will and won't accept. It's how change happens.
It's a moment owned by a community who fought for the justice they were owed. Sally Lockwood, Sky News, Minneapolis.
Now, what is notable on the streets of Minneapolis tonight is how quiet it is at George Floyd Square, as it's now called, the scene of his death back in May of last year. There's been a peaceful celebration of his life, fireworks, dancing, no sign of any protests, no sign of any rioting. But what people do want to hear is what exactly is going to happen next, and what will be those steps that everybody from Joe Biden down have promised them as a result of what they saw in that verdict. Some big questions for the political leaders here about what they will do. Well, we'll be asking that question to a number of people throughout the course of the morning with a range of guests. At 5:30, we'll be speaking to the son of the civil rights activist Martin Luther King, along with a member of George Floyd's legal team, Jasmine Rand. And at 8:30, we'll be joined by George Floyd's childhood friend, Cyril White. So stay with us for all of that.
Greg, thank you. Well, let's talk right now to the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, Oliver Dowden. Good to see you this morning. Look, the impact of Mr. Floyd's death was felt across the world, including here in the UK. What can we take from this verdict?
Well, good morning. And I think that the first thing that we can take from it is that justice has been done. And I think it is so important in situations like this, particularly when people feel that the justice system has not served them in the past. They see in the United States that justice has been done. Certainly in terms of how we address wider questions of racial inequality and racist abuse, certainly in my own brief, I'm very focused on the sort of racist abuse that we see online, which is why I have been engaging, for example, recently with football players to discuss their experiences and see what we can do, particularly through our forthcoming online harms legislation, to make sure that we crack down on the sort of vile racist abuse that we see routinely online.
Well, that does raise its own questions, doesn't it? Because, I mean, as you rightly say, there's been a lot of reported cases online. It has been, you know, made more apparent, I guess, by people talking about it more openly. But I mean, it's a wider reflection on society, isn't it? That there are still people in this country who think it is quite all right to take to what is a public forum and say these vile things. How do we begin to address that?
Well, I think it's very interesting that those sort of things were routinely heard on the terraces and in stadiums even a few years ago. I know, sadly, it still happens to a degree now, but there is a lot less of it. What we need to ensure is the sort of things that people wouldn't feel comfortable saying on the street. They don't feel they have a safe space to do it online. We need to be robust in addressing this. And I mean, I found it extraordinary speaking to some of our leading black players. So first thing in the morning, last thing at night, they turn on their mobile phone and they've got this abuse coming in. It is just not acceptable. We're working with the social media companies in the short run. But in the longer term, we're bringing forward this online harms legislation to make sure there are proper duties on social media companies to stamp out this sort of thing from happening. And if they fail to act, then they will face very large fines, up to 10% of their global revenue.
I mean, look, you're absolutely right. I don't think anyone would disagree with you that action has to be taken so that people cannot post this sort of material. But I wonder what we do, what your personal view is on how we tackle the wider systemic problem, if you like, that there are, whether people can post it or not, it's the fact that people are thinking it, which causes a huge amount of concern.
Well, I can't stop what people think, but I think we should be clear that the sort of values that you and I hold, and almost all of your listeners who find this sort of racist abuse repugnant, we should not be allowing a space for it to exist online. I also think across my wider responsibilities as Secretary of State for digital culture and media and sport, I'm also interested in ensuring that we create opportunities for people from disadvantaged backgrounds of all ethnic backgrounds to ensure that they have opportunities, for example, in the film industry, working on apprenticeships, to make sure that people have the opportunity to thrive.
Talking of people from all sorts of backgrounds, it was the fans of, the grassroots fans of football who've really had their say over the last, 12 hours, really. I went to bed last night and Chelsea had pulled out of the Super League, woke up this morning and they'd all gone. I mean, this is a real victory for fans, isn't it?
Yes, it is a victory for fans. And in fact, the country has been united in condemning these proposals. And the government has stood firmly behind the footballing authorities and saying, we will do whatever it takes to stop this proposal. We were willing to take very, very bold measures to stop this proposal going ahead. And I'm very glad that the fans, with the backing of government and others, have had their say. But it's very important that we don't see this as the end of the process. What this has highlighted more than ever is the need to look at the wider governance of football. That's why I announced on Monday a fan-led review led by Tracy Crouch, someone who I think commands support from many people from all different clubs and across the political spectrum, to look at how we address football governance, football finance, and indeed the whole fan experience.
Do you think, though, that is going to be enough in itself to stop these sort of moves from happening again?
Well, we have been clear as a government, and I was explicitly clear from Sunday night. Prime Minister and I met with fans and with football governing bodies yesterday morning. I met with the president of UEFA on Monday, and I'll be speaking to him again later today. We've been absolutely resolute in saying that we will not have our national game taken away from us for profit. This is as much part of our national heritage as our great stately homes, our galleries, our museums, our theatres, our cathedrals. And we as a government will do whatever it takes to step up to protect it. And I'm very glad that working with fans, we have given strength to fans in stopping this. And I pay tribute to all of the fans. And we saw it last night with Chelsea fans. They won't put up with this, and I'm glad that clubs have listened to it.
I mean, it's nice to see you applauding the passion, and there is an awful lot of passion there. But what about the passion of some of your colleagues? And I'm thinking of Johnny Mercer, someone who did 3 tours of Afghanistan, hugely passionate about the work he did, passionate about the armed forces, passionate about the veterans, who, in effect said he was forced to resign as Veterans Minister last night because, the Prime Minister is not sticking to the veterans pledge that he signed in the run-up to the general election in 2019. Something's got to change, hasn't it?
Well, I have a great deal of respect for Johnny. I like him enormously, and I work closely with him as a minister. I don't think Johnny is entirely correct on this. First of all, we set up the Office of Veterans Affairs. Indeed, I worked with him on that. We funded that office, and we've introduced a number of measures to support veterans through it. In respect of veterans being hounded and those real concerns that we have pledged to address in terms of ensuring that veterans don't face the constant threat of going back through the courts for past actions.
But forgive me for interrupting, but I know you appreciate tight for time because you want to move on to do something else. But in terms of the constant hounding, I mean, what he's saying is yes, you've brought in that cover for some people, but not for those people who served in Northern Ireland, who have already been the subject of a lot of investigations. We're talking veterans now in their 70s and 80s who, Mr. Mercer says, are in some cases drinking themselves to death because they're so concerned about what's happening to them.
Well, as you rightly say, in respect of overseas operations, we've got the bill that will conclude its passage through the House, I believe, in the next couple of days. In relation to Northern Ireland veterans, we are currently working through government on that. We're actually, ministers as we speak are signing off legislation on that, which we will bring forward in the next session to address precisely that problem. And I know from conversations with the Prime Minister that he is absolutely determined to address this.
OK, look, appreciate your time this morning, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ali Fortescue was listening to that. Morning to you. I mean, look, in terms of the football, which is what falls most under the remit of the Secretary of State this morning, clearly delighted, but saying that, you know, they're in effect going to try to stop this happening again. It's unclear as to whether they actually could.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's unclear as to whether they actually could. We've heard about lots of things they were trying to do potentially to disrupt the clubs from being able to do this, things like policing. And I think it is a difficult line when you're talking about the state interacting in the free market in that way. And I think there is a worry that the way that the way football is going, will we see something like this potentially happening again? It seems almost like the natural progression when we're talking about clubs that inevitably will want to chase the money. So you rightly were asking him about that, and he made clear that they are going to, this Tracy Crouch review that we know is ongoing is going to continue to look at this, how clubs are managed. But I think there is a difficult line for the government to tread here, and I think there will be a lot of relief that ultimately it was fans and the pressure rather than the government really having to step in that has led to the clubs withdrawing their support for the Super League.
OK, lovely. Ali, thank you. Well, despite the departures, the Super League said it was convinced the status quo of European football does need to change, and it was considering steps to reshape the project. Enda Brady reports.
This was Chelsea fans taking their message straight to the club's doorstep.
We want our Chelsea back! We want our Chelsea back!
Hundreds of supporters blocked the entrance to Stamford Bridge to highlight their opposition to the proposed European Super League.
Well, Chelsea's owner Roman Abramovich famously says very little in public, but tonight here, his club's fans have certainly made their voices heard.
They have to listen. If the fans aren't behind it, then I will honestly boycott the matches. No one's going to watch them. It's over for them.
Within minutes, word came through that the club had decided to withdraw from the competition, followed quickly by Manchester City.
I am happy, but we should never have joined it in the first place. They should know what Chelsea's about, and they should know the fans wouldn't be happy. Fans weren't consulted, clearly the players weren't consulted.
Within hours, the other 4 English clubs had also pulled out. In Manchester, the issue brought together fans of both clubs, City and United, both against the proposals.
I'm absolutely delighted, you know, how events have unfurled this evening.
It's a relief, first and foremost, but long term, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that our club doesn't sign us up for this again.
United's executive vice chairman Ed Woodward later resigned from his role at Old Trafford. And this was the reaction from former Manchester United defender Gary Neville, whose opposition to the plans had gone viral earlier in the week.
And these 6 sets of owners in this country, and obviously the other ones in Europe, have misread this situation badly. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We've been locked in for 8 months. We're not in a decent place here. And they've tried to run away with the crown jewels whilst we're all down. And they've basically made everybody rise.
A Premier League captains' meeting is scheduled for later today, but it seems the whistle has blown on this project before a ball has even been kicked. Enda Brady, Sky News at Stamford Bridge.
Well, at 8:45, I'm going to be talking to the former FA Chief Executive and Chief Executive of the Football Supporters Association, and also a former professional footballer, about the very latest on the European Super League. Let's take a look at some of the other stories this morning. And Tony Blair has said UK authorities should publish more information on the COVID vaccination programme to allay concerns about the AstraZeneca jab. The former Prime Minister warned that global vaccination efforts risk being undermined if they're discredited for reasons based on what he called unjustified anxieties about safety or efficacy. And I'm going to be talking to Tony Blair about the vaccination programme at 9:15 this morning. China's President Xi Jinping will attend a US-led climate summit on Thursday, following an invitation from President Biden. President Biden has invited dozens of world leaders to the virtual summit as the United States rejoins the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Beijing and Washington clashed recently during the first high-level talks between the two in Alaska last month. Jim Steinman, the Grammy Award-winning composer who wrote Bat Out of Hell for Meat Loaf, has died at the age of 73. His brother says he died near his home in Connecticut. His other brother died just a few days earlier from kidney failure. Now, experts say regular exercise lowers the risk of dying from infectious diseases like COVID by more than a third. Scientists at Glasgow Caledonian University have found 2.5 hours a week of physical activity that gets you a little bit out of breath can have a significant impact on immunity. Now, the Queen is to mark her 95th birthday today, just days after her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, was laid to rest in Windsor. This will mark the first birthday in over 3/4 of a century without her consort by her side. Well, let's talk to our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills. And this is not a birthday for the Queen to celebrate, is it? But simply one to mark, I would imagine.
Well, yeah, for the first time in 73 years, she will mark her birthday without Prince Philip by her side. And while on the weekend we saw that at the funeral she was in many ways a picture of composure, I suspect behind the scenes privately, the last 10 days have been very difficult for her. And for anyone who loses a loved one, often it is those birthdays and anniversaries that can be particularly challenging. Now, we're told that she is going to mark her birthday in a private, low-key manner. We're not anticipating that any pictures are going to be released. There aren't going to be any military gun salutes, as you would usually expect, and that's because the royal family are still in mourning. But also the point was made to me that it was never going to be kind of a big occasion anyway. The focus was always going to be on marking Prince Philip's 100th birthday, which was due to take place in June instead. And of course, actually around her actual birthday, often there aren't big celebrations because we have that Trooping the Colour that happens in the summer. Of course, again, for a second year, that's had to be called off because of COVID. But they're still working out the plans about how that's officially marked in the summer. But also, of course, you would anticipate that members of the family will arrive at Windsor at times today. Of course, that will be kept incredibly private. But as we heard last week, the family very much saying that they will continue to rally around the Queen as Prince Philip would have expected them to.
OK, Rhiannon, thank you. OK, time for a check on the weather for you this morning. Naz, there you are. Good to see you this morning. What have you got for us today?
Well, it's looking fine again for many areas, but we do have a weak cold front working its way southwards, and what that's doing is bringing colder air from the north and cloudy skies across southern areas with a few sharp showers.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. So, generally speaking, we're looking at fine conditions for today and for the rest of the week. But over the next 24 hours or so, we've got a weak cold front working its way southwards. And it is going to bring with it cooler air from the north as it sweeps down further south. And in fact, it's also bringing cloudy skies this morning across many central and northern parts of England, Wales and Ireland. So quite a grey start across these areas for this morning, and a few spits and spots of rain are likely as well. Whereas across parts of the north, it's a mainly dry and chilly start to the day. It's quite frosty, particularly cold in some rural spots of Scotland where temperatures have dropped below freezing. Across the south, it's a fairly mild start, mainly dry and bright, but there is some mist and fog across southern and eastern parts of England. Now, going into this afternoon, that weak cold front moves its way further southwards to many central and southwestern parts of England and Wales, bringing cloudier skies, still a bit of brightness, but cloudier skies. A few showers are likely to break out across southern areas, especially so across the southwest. They could be quite sharp later. But as you can see, it still stays quite mild across southern areas, especially in the southwest, where locally temperatures could get to 17 or 18 degrees Celsius. Further north, temperatures will be lower. It's a cooler day, but there's lots of sunshine to be had across Scotland, northern England, Northern Ireland, and later across central and southern areas.
Well, welcome back to Minneapolis. Let's get more now on our top story. The former police officer Derek Chauvin has been found guilty of the murder of George Floyd. The case sparked global outrage, triggering protests in the US not seen since the civil rights unrest of the 1960s, and conversations about the legacy of colonialism, slavery and racist policing here in the US and in the UK as well. Our US correspondent Mark Stone has been taking a look at how the case has changed the United States and beyond.
George Floyd was not the first, and he will not be the last. But he was the first whose final moments we all saw. Nearly 10 minutes of agony, filmed, and it triggered something globally. From the streets of the place where he died to the steps of the White House.
Look at America! They're killing us!
People could see themselves in George Floyd. They could see a person who looked like them, more or less, being maltreated by the police. And I think that many people felt that that was unfair. It was quite remarkable.
And it stirred something well beyond America. Black Lives Matter was a movement rekindled. It prompted introspection, difficult conversations about race, power and colonialism.
Black Lives Matter!
People and their governments were forced to confront their own history, legacies of white supremacy in so many parts of the world.
We hear stories, but that's very different than seeing stories. So watching the face of the policeman, of Derek, watching his face, watching someone being killed, that was suddenly communicated across the globe. Here you were intimately there and present watching this take place. And I think that for a range of reasons, that simply touched, ignited perhaps an issue that otherwise you had excuses to turn your head, to look the other way.
The challenges of systemic racism, of racial disparity, had been tragically captured in the death of one man. And across the country, the moments people heard the verdict, guilty. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Well, Derek Chauvin's guilty verdict has sparked reaction from civil rights activists around the world, among them Martin Luther King III, who joins us now. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this morning. First of all, I guess, how significant a moment do you believe this is for the United States?
So I think that it certainly is an extraordinary, significant moment, because this has never happened where an officer has been charged, and there have been officers convicted from time to time, but this is extraordinarily significant. All charges that he was accused of, he was convicted of, which means that maybe we can start anew. But there are we have a long way to go. This is really just the beginning in a real sense.
There's so much talk today about the change that needs to happen. What do you think would represent concrete change out of all of the talk today? What do you think America needs to see as a result of what happened today?
I would hope that the United States Senate would pass the George Floyd Policing Act, which is, again, just one step, but it's one significant step, because It disallows policemen to use the chokehold and the other pieces of things in that legislation. I think, though, we have to overall take a look at policing in all communities across our nation, and particularly policing as it relates to the Black community and to the brown community, because there are serious problems in how policing occurs. In the Black community, policing is there's over-policing. And the reaction, people are not treated with dignity and respect. People are not treated like they want to be treated. They treat people very, very poorly in many cases. And that has to be addressed. And that has to happen through city councils, through mayors, through the state and the policing authorities. So this really is it's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
What do you think the message is to police departments, to law enforcement, to the judiciary around America as a result of what happened in court?
What I hope is that this was not an action against police. This was an action against one individual who handled a situation that became fatal unnecessarily. And so it was barbaric, it was inhumane, it was insensitive, it was final for George Floyd so tragically. My hope, though, is the message that is sent is that you're going to be held accountable for what you do. There are body cameras now that police have to wear. So everything is captured from that perspective, as well as there are individuals with smartphones who are capturing. And usually police are not held accountable. So I think if we are able to ensure that, yes, you're going to be held accountable, perhaps it may begin a method of policemen treating people differently.
Of course, your father famously preached non-violence. We've seen a peaceful celebration in Minneapolis tonight. No sign of anything like we saw last year after the death of George Floyd by way of a reaction. What have you made of the reaction across the country to the verdict today?
I think people, first of all, were relieved, just generally relieved. I had something strange to happen in our home. When the first verdict, the judge read the first verdict is guilty, our doors one of the doors in our home just started rattling. It's weird. It was almost like the spirit of my father and mother were here saying, okay, we're moving in the right direction. This is good. It had not, shaken before then. But getting back to the nation, I think relief, people felt really positive. People felt that maybe they can begin to have faith in the system again, because people have lost faith. Black people have lost faith because the system historically does not work for the Black and brown and communities of color.
We have to look, as always, at the political climate in Washington. Do you sense that there's a different tone? Obviously, there's a different president now from when George Floyd died. Do you sense that the political climate is right to see that change happen, or is it just more gridlock like everything else?
Well, I hope so, but I do not know. I am hopeful, but I am not. I don't feel that, oh, wow, this is one incident that is going to cause Congress to automatically just begin to work with each other and cause enough votes to support the George Floyd Act. There shouldn't even be any questions about it passing. But unfortunately, that is just not the case. I haven't heard any of the reactions of our Republican friends. We'll have to see.
It's the early hours where you are. I know it's the early hours here in Minneapolis. What do you think America will wake up to tomorrow? Do you think there will be a confidence that things will change? The Attorney General here said this is accountability in one case. For justice to happen, it needs to be everyone in the United States. Do you sense that will come and America will confront that moment now?
What I sense is that can come. I don't have a sense yet until we see whether or not there's an action after this particular action. And actually not just an action, many acts, have several actions to address, systematic institutional racism in policing, to address the fact that you need police from the community that they police, so they are stakeholders. They have a vested interest in how the policing takes place, so that you have more citizen review boards and no, resistance to that, so that you have, more psychological evaluations that are more in depth, because we have to understand who it is that who are being hired, what kind of police are being hired. So there's a wholesale review that has to be done. And I think we're just going to have to wait to see. I think this was a good first step, but we got a long, long way to go.
Martin Luther King III there in Atlanta. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Well, we can speak now to a member of the Floyd family's legal team. The civil rights lawyer Jasmine Rand joins us, and we've seen the reaction from so many of your colleagues on the Floyd team. First of all, what was your reaction when you heard that word guilty in the court?
I mean, my reaction, I was literally shaking, and it brought me back to the moment that I watched the announcement in George Zimmerman's trial for killing Trayvon Martin, and we heard that not guilty. And I remember hearing that word not guilty and feeling such disbelief and disappointment in that moment. And 9 years later today, I felt vindicated when I heard guilty, guilty, guilty on all three counts. And every time I heard the guilty, it was symbolic of not just justice for George Floyd, but when I heard the word guilty, I heard Trayvon Martin. When I heard the word guilty, I heard Michael Brown. When I heard the word guilty, I heard, Tamir Rice.
You mentioned those other names, and I guess that reminds us of how much this is bigger than just the George Floyd story. How confident are you that things will change, whatever the promises coming from the politicians as a result of what's happened in this trial?
Well, I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. Today was a victory in racial justice, but I would say that we have not yet won the war. Shortly, or essentially at the same time, the guilty verdict was announced, holding Derek Chauvin accountable for killing George Floyd. A 15-year-old girl named Ma'Khia Bryant was killed in Columbus, Ohio. And so we have a long way to go in terms of achieving true racial equality in this nation.
What do you think the steps are to get there then? What concrete steps would you like to see that can immediately address some of what you're talking about there?
Well, as Mr. King just said, most importantly is the passage of, the George Floyd Act to ensure more justice in policing, specifically in Black and Brown communities. But you can't legislate hearts and minds. And the prosecutor said something so significant in the closing argument to me. He said, this entire time, you've heard the defense tell you that George Floyd's heart was too big. And now you know that Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd because his heart was too small. And I think that our hearts being too small, that's the problem in our nation. It is a, societal problem. Racism, is in our roots here in America. The White House was built on slavery, and we have a lot of historical wrongs and historical injustices to correct. And I think we have a long way to go to achieving true justice and equality in our nation.
This, of course, was the trial of one police officer. 3 others will face trial later in the year as it stands at the moment. What do you think the message that the law enforcement around the US will need to take from what happened during the course of this trial and the verdict?
I think that this will change the conduct of law enforcement. I think that law enforcement now see that they're going to be held accountable when they murder Black and Brown people, any person for that matter, in a manner that is unlawful. And so I think it's extremely important in terms of holding officers accountable. And I believe that it will make an impact in correcting officer behavior.
Jasmine Rand, thank you very much for your time on a historic day, certainly for the Floyd family. A peaceful night here in Minneapolis, nothing like the protests we saw back in May and June, a reflection of what happened in that verdict. Much more to come from Minneapolis during the course of the show. Now back to you, Stephen.
OK, Greg, thank you. Well, let's talk to Labour's Shadow Business Minister, Lucy Powell, who joins us now. It's good to see you this morning. Can we reflect on the situation in the United States to begin with? Because President Biden says this could be a moment of significant change. Now, considering how much reaction there was to the death of Mr Floyd here in the UK, could it be a point of change for us as well?
Well, I really hope so. I mean, like many others, I was very relieved, really, and pleased with the verdict in this case. And there's some justice there for George Floyd's family. But we can't take an isolated verdict as change itself. Change will come because of institutional change, cultural change, and the way that our system works. And that applies here in the UK just as much as it does in the US. And here, I'm afraid, in the UK, our criminal justice system isn't fair towards those from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. You only have to look at the statistics to know that. You are much more likely to be stopped and searched. You are much more likely to find yourself facing the harshest sentences and to be found guilty of those harshest sentences. It's why we have more than 50% of those in youth offender institutes are from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, when they make up a much smaller fraction of our population as a whole. So, these moments are only good moments if they are not moments, but they bring about profound and lasting change. So it's a step in the right direction that's happened in the US, because I think it's the first time in a long time that a verdict like this has been passed. But it will only mean something if it's really, really followed through in a long-term, meaningful way.
OK, look, thank you for that. Look, I know there's concerns from you and the Labour Party today about Liberty Steel and the potential of insolvency there, despite the fact the owner has said, he's not going to close any of the plants down on his watch, but we know they're under an awful lot of financial strain. I mean, the government seems to be indicating it would take action if there was insolvency to help protect the jobs in the factory. You're not happy with that, are you?
Well, look, first thing I want to say is that I very much hope that the refinancing plans that Liberty Steel Company owners have come to fruition, because that would be the most straightforward solution for the plant and all the supply chain as well. But the government's job, and therefore our job as well, is to think about the eventuality that doesn't come to pass. And, there are some uncertainties around that. And I really worry about the government's approach, which is really standing by and almost waiting for that to happen before they intervene. And what we're calling for today is that the government take action before that point, because if the company does become insolvent, the people who pay the heaviest price for that, even if then the government steps in after that point and puts in the official receiver and takes over the company for a while, the people who pay the heaviest price are those in the supply chain. And there's over 3,000 jobs in the supply chain. And when this happened in the past with British Steel, the suppliers lost around £500 million that they never got back. So we want the government to intervene early, or at least have plans to intervene early to save the supply chain, as well as supporting the workers in Liberty Steel too.
So intervene early, how? I mean, stepping in, taking over, providing some sort of rescue package themselves? How would it work?
Well, how it could work, I mean, as I say, let's first of all hope that the refinancing works. And we may be still weeks away from knowing that for sure, one way or the other. So at the point, let's say that the refinancing doesn't work, the government could step in at that point, bringing together all the creditors with the company and seeking a voluntary arrangement for them to step in and take over at that point, rather than waiting. We have quite difficult corporate insolvency laws in this country. We don't have the so-called Chapter 11 process that they do in America, where there would be a safe place for this to all happen and protect suppliers, customers and creditors as well. But we're asking for the government to consider stepping in early in that way to protect the whole system. And I think if they did that, if they said today that they have that option on the table, it would give suppliers much more confidence now to carry on trading and doing business with Liberty, which is already causing some effect on the business as confidence is beginning to sort of ebb away, because suppliers can't be sure that their invoices would be paid in the coming weeks. And the government action now could provide that extra confidence.
OK. Look, we're talking to Tony Blair a little bit later on in the programme. He's really pushing today for better vaccination, for better messaging on vaccination. I mean, particularly in the light of the concerns around AstraZeneca. And he's said that some of the concerns around the blood clotting issues are unjustified. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that we need to focus on the positives of the vaccination rather than these small level of negatives that we have seen come through?
Well, I think the vaccination programme and the uptake from the public has been, a fantastically positive story for this country. And, people are queuing up and ready to get their appointments as soon as they are in a qualifying group. And I think that is brilliant. But I would share some of the concerns that Tony Blair and others have there, that maybe perhaps sometimes we don't amplify the positives as much as we amplify some of the potential negatives. And we do need to keep these risks. There are risks in everything we're doing in relation to COVID. We do have to keep those risks in proportion to the other side of the ledger, really, in terms of the positives and the need for vaccination, the need for us to reopen the economy and reopen the country carefully, cautiously and slowly. And with that will come some risks as well. So, I think the public are getting good at sort of evaluating those risks for themselves. And we haven't seen much impact, I don't think, in terms of uptake of the vaccinations or AstraZeneca. But it certainly can't help the situation if it's overly negative coverage instead of looking at the positives as well.
But I mean, the vaccine uptake is slowing down as we head towards the younger age groups who are less likely to be seriously affected by COVID. And it also, I mean, really, it circles back to the whole racism issue, doesn't it? Because we know vaccine hesitancy amongst, black groups in particular is still pretty high. What needs to be done to really get that messaging across that this is what needs to happen?
Well, you are absolutely right. There has been less of an uptake in the vaccination in some groups, particularly those from Black and some ethnic minority backgrounds. And that is a worry and concern, especially as many of those communities have been most at risk of the most adverse effects of COVID. So I think as the vaccination programme continues, we are going to need more tailored messaging, a more targeted approach to those that still haven't taken up the vaccine, who do qualify, and that we'll put those in that group. And we'll definitely need, I think, a different approach when it comes to the younger age range, for whom they don't really see the risk of COVID to themselves directly in the same way that maybe some of the older population does. So we've got off to a fantastic start. Over 30 million people now had a first dose, and 10 million have had their second dose. But we're definitely going to have to up the ante to get to a point where we've got most of the population vaccinated by July, especially those groups that have been reluctant so far.
Lucy Powell, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, let's have a check-in on the weather for you this morning. Naz, what's in store today?
Well, we're seeing a little bit of everything today. A weak cold front is working its way southwards, bringing cloudy skies across many central and southwestern areas with a few sharp showers, but further north, lots of sunshine, but cooler.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. So for the rest of this week, it's generally looking fine, but we do have a weak cold front working its way southwards over the next 24 hours, and behind that, cooler air will come through. So by the weekend, temperatures will be lower, but around average for the time of year. It is currently across central and northern parts of England and Wales, where it's quite cloudy with a few bits of light rain or drizzle. Some mist and fog across the southeast. That makes its way further southwards to central and southern parts of England and Wales this afternoon, with some showers there. For Scotland, Northern England, Northern Ireland, the Republic, sunny and mainly dry.